Before you begin, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next part of this intense mafia romance story. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft metallic sigh, and Maya thought nothing of it at first. It was just another late evening in downtown Chicago, another exhausting day at the marketing firm, another ride down from the 42nd floor to the noisy street below. Her heels ached, her phone battery was at 3%, and all she wanted was to get home, eat leftover pasta, and fall asleep with the TV still on. She pressed the lobby button, leaned against the wall, and exhaled. That was when the elevator stopped. Not at a floor, not smoothly. It jolted, hard, and the lights flickered once, twice, then steadied into a dim emergency glow. Seriously, she muttered under her breath. She reached for the emergency button, but before she could press it, she realized she wasn't alone. Across from her stood a man she hadn't noticed before, tall and solid, dressed in a dark tailored suit that looked expensive in a way she couldn't explain. He wasn't checking his phone or pacing in irritation. He was calm. Too calm. His dark eyes lifted to meet hers, steady and unreadable, and for a brief second, Maya forgot about the elevator entirely. Something about him made the air feel heavier, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks. "It appears we're stuck," he said, his voice low, controlled, unmistakably American with a faint edge that suggested power rather than accent. "I noticed," Maya replied, forcing a polite tone even as her pulse quickened. She pressed the emergency button anyway. A crackling voice responded, assuring them help was on the way, estimating 40 minutes due to a system malfunction. 40 minutes. In a metal box. With a stranger who looked like he belonged on the cover of a crime novel. The man nodded slightly, as if 40 minutes meant nothing to him. "These things happen," he said. "You're very calm about it," Maya said, hugging her bag closer to her chest. "I've been in worse situations," he replied, a faint hint of a smile touching his lips. Not warm, not cold, just confident. They stood in silence for a moment, the hum of the stalled elevator filling the space. Maya studied him despite herself. Mid-30s, maybe older. Clean-shaven, sharp jawline, eyes that missed nothing. There was an intensity about him that made her both nervous and curious. Finally, she cleared her throat. "I'm Maya. Victor," he said. "No last name." "Of course not." As the minutes passed, the initial panic faded, replaced by an unexpected sense of conversation. Victor asked her what she did, listened without interrupting, actually listened, as if her words mattered. That alone surprised her. When she asked him the same question, he paused, then said, "I run a family business." "That sounds vague," she said, raising an eyebrow. "It has to be," he replied, and for the first time, his smile reached his eyes. Somewhere around minute 15, the elevator lights flickered again, and Maya's nerves spiked. She hated confined spaces. Victor noticed immediately. "You're claustrophobic," he said, not as a question. "A little," she admitted. "Okay, a lot. Sit," he said gently, gesturing to the floor. He took off his suit jacket and folded it, offering it like a cushion. The gesture was unexpectedly thoughtful, and she found herself trusting him enough to accept. Sitting there, shoulder to shoulder, the space didn't feel as small anymore. Around minute 25, the conversation shifted. Less small talk, more honesty. Maya talked about moving to the city alone, about ambition, about fear of ending up unnoticed. Victor listened, then surprised her by saying, "You're not invisible. People just don't know how to look properly." She laughed softly. "That's an intense thing to say to someone you just met in a broken elevator." "I don't waste words," he replied. By minute 35, Maya realized something that unsettled her even more than the breakdown itself. She felt safe. With a stranger. A powerful, mysterious stranger who, according to every warning her instincts should have been screaming, was probably dangerous. And yet, when the elevator suddenly jolted back to life and the lights brightened, a small, irrational part of her felt disappointed. The doors opened at the lobby with a quiet ding. The spell broke. People rushed forward, maintenance workers apologized, life resumed. Maya stood, smoothing her skirt, suddenly unsure of what to say. Victor put his jacket back on, every movement controlled, composed. "Dinner," he said simply. "Dinner," she echoed. "Yes," he continued. "You owe yourself a good meal after this. Let me take you." She hesitated. Every sensible thought told her to say no. To walk away. To forget the last 40 minutes ever happened. But something in his eyes, respectful, patient, unpressuring, made it different. He wasn't demanding. He was offering. 40 minutes ago, she had been counting down the seconds to escape. Now, standing there in the open lobby, Maya surprised herself. She didn't say yes. Not yet. She smiled instead and said, "I'll think about it." Victor inclined his head. "I'll be here." Maya walked out of the building and into the cool Chicago night, her mind louder than the traffic around her. She told herself to keep walking, to call an Uber, to go home and forget Victor and his calm voice and those unsettling eyes. But her feet slowed without permission. She glanced back through the glass doors of the lobby. Victor was still there, exactly where he said he'd be, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, like a man who had never doubted the outcome of anything in his life. That confidence annoyed her. It also intrigued her. She turned fully this time and stepped back inside. "Okay," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Dinner. But somewhere public." Victor's lips curved slightly. Of course. They didn't walk side by side at first. It felt too intimate too fast. Instead, they moved through the city with a respectful distance, the streetlights reflecting off wet pavement, the air buzzing with Friday night energy. He led her to a restaurant she'd passed 100 times but never entered, quiet, understated, the kind of place you only noticed if you knew exactly what you were looking for. Inside, the maitre d' greeted Victor by name without asking for a reservation. That should have been her first real warning. They were seated in a corner booth, secluded but not hidden. As menus were placed in front of them, Maya studied Victor again. Out of the elevator's tight space, he somehow seemed even more imposing. Not loud, not aggressive, just controlled, like the room subtly adjusted itself around him. "So," she said, breaking the silence. "Family business." He met her gaze. "You're persistent." "I'm curious," she corrected. He considered that, then said, "Logistics. Imports. Exports. That still sounds vague." "It's safer that way," he replied calmly. The word safer lingered between them. Maya took a sip of water, telling herself she was overthinking it. Plenty of powerful men worked in boring industries. But when Victor spoke, people listened. When he moved, people noticed. She couldn't remember the last time a stranger had made her this aware of her surroundings. Dinner arrived, and conversation flowed more easily than she expected. Victor asked about her childhood, her parents, what had pushed her to leave her hometown. No one had ever asked her those questions with such focus, like every answer mattered. When she asked about his past, he didn't deflect, but he didn't reveal much either. He spoke of responsibility at a young age, of learning that power was less about force and more about control. Control of what? She asked. Everything, he said simply. By the time dessert was offered, Maya realized she'd lost track of time again. Just like in the elevator. The city outside felt distant, unreal, as if this booth existed in its own world. When she excused herself to the restroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror and barely recognized herself. Her eyes were brighter, her expression softer. She looked interested. That scared her. When she returned, Victor was on his phone, his tone low, sharp. "No mistakes," he said. "I'll handle it." He ended the call and looked up at her as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The air felt tighter. "Everything okay?" she asked. "Yes," he said. Then, after a beat, "But I should be honest with you." Her stomach tightened. "About what?" "There are people in my world who don't like unpredictability," he said. "And you are unpredictable." "That doesn't sound like my problem," she said lightly, though her pulse quickened. "It could be," he replied, not as a threat, but as a fact. They left the restaurant together, and outside, a black car pulled up almost immediately. The driver stepped out, nodding to Victor without a word. Maya stopped walking. "I didn't agree to this," she said, suddenly wary. Victor turned to her, his expression serious. "You're not getting in that car unless you want to." She studied him, searching for pressure, for manipulation. She found none. Just patience. Choice. That mattered more than she expected. "I'll take a cab," she said. He nodded. "I'll make sure you get one safely." As she sat in the cab minutes later, Maya looked back to see Victor standing on the sidewalk, watching until the car pulled away. She told herself it was the last time she'd see him. That this was just a strange, intense night she'd eventually laugh about. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. Dinner wasn't a mistake. Neither was meeting you. She stared at the screen, heart racing. Somewhere deep down, a voice whispered that her life had just shifted onto a path she couldn't step off so easily. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to. Maya didn't sleep that night, not really, because every time she closed her eyes she saw the elevator walls closing in again, felt the strange calm that had settled over her when Victor spoke, heard the quiet authority in his voice that made chaos feel temporary and fear feel optional, and when morning finally came she dragged herself out of bed convinced she would wake up to regret, but instead there was only a restless curiosity buzzing under her skin, the kind that made her check her phone more often than necessary, reread a single message too many times, and wonder how a man she had known for less than an hour in a broken elevator had managed to rearrange her thoughts so completely. She went to work on autopilot, smiled through meetings, nodded at coworkers, and pretended spreadsheets mattered while her mind replayed small details she hadn't noticed before, the way Victor had shifted closer when the lights flickered, how he never once invaded her space unless she leaned in first, how his offer of dinner had felt less like a proposition and more like an inevitability, and it was just after lunch when her phone vibrated again, the same unknown number, the same calm certainty in the message asking if she'd eaten and suggesting a cafe near her office that had excellent coffee and better privacy, which should have alarmed her but instead made her pause, breathe, and type back a cautious yes that surprised even herself. They met an hour later, and this time there was no elevator, no forced proximity, just a quiet corner table and the awareness that she could leave at any moment, yet she didn't, because Victor greeted her with the same composed presence, the same respectful distance, and the same intensity that made the outside world feel faint, and as they talked she noticed subtle things she'd missed before, like how his eyes tracked every entrance and exit without interrupting the conversation, how his phone stayed face down on the table until it vibrated and he silenced it without looking, how people seemed to glance his way and then quickly look elsewhere, and when she finally asked him why he kept choosing places like this, quiet, tucked away, protected, he didn't dodge the question but answered honestly, saying that attention was a currency and he preferred not to spend it unnecessarily, which led her to ask the question she'd been holding back since the night before, the one that had followed her into sleep and back out again, the one that felt dangerous just to voice. Victor, what exactly do you do? And this time he didn't smile, didn't soften the edges, just studied her for a long moment as if deciding how much truth she could handle before saying that his family-controlled operations most people pretended didn't exist, that power-filled gaps left by laws and politics, that order was sometimes enforced where chaos would otherwise thrive, and when she said quietly, "That sounds like the Mafia," he didn't correct her, didn't deny it, only said that labels were for people on the outside and that the inside was far more complicated, which should have sent her running but instead anchored her in place because there was no pride in his voice, no threat, just responsibility, and she realized with a shiver that Victor wasn't dangerous because he enjoyed it but because he was capable of it, and that distinction mattered more than she wanted to admit. The conversation shifted after that, heavier but more real, and he told her about the cost of leadership, about trust being rare and betrayal being expensive, about nights when sleep came harder than any negotiation, and she found herself sharing things she'd never planned to say out loud, about how she'd spent her life trying to be invisible enough to be safe and visible enough to be valued, about how independence sometimes felt like isolation dressed up as freedom, and when she stopped herself, worried she'd said too much, Victor simply nodded and said he understood more than she thought, that strength didn't always look loud or fearless, that sometimes it looked like showing up every day despite the weight, and the sincerity in his words cracked something open in her chest. They left the cafe together, walking slower this time, closer without touching, until a black SUV appeared at the end of the block and Victor's attention sharpened instantly, his body angling just slightly toward her in a protective way that made her heart stutter, and when two men stepped out she felt the shift before he said anything, felt the invisible line between his world and hers suddenly drawn in bold ink, and he spoke to them quietly but firmly, sending one away and instructing the other to wait at a distance, then turned back to Maya and said he needed to know something before this went any further, needed her to understand that proximity to him meant exposure, that people watched, calculated, tested, and that while he could protect what was his, he wouldn't lie to her about the risks. And standing there on the sidewalk with the city moving around them and the future narrowing into a single choice, Maya realized that this wasn't about danger anymore but about agency, about whether she would keep living on the edges of her own life or step fully into something uncertain but real. And when she told him she needed time, he didn't argue, didn't pressure, only said he respected her decision and that the door would remain open as long as she chose to walk through it. And as she went home that night, phone silent, mind loud, Maya understood that the elevator hadn't trapped her with Victor at all. It had introduced her to a version of herself that no longer wanted safe answers or quiet endings, and that realization followed her into the dark, waiting for her next move. Maya tried to return to normal after that afternoon, but normal had quietly packed its bags and left without saying goodbye, because every routine now felt borrowed, every familiar street slightly altered by the knowledge that Victor existed somewhere in the same city, moving pieces she couldn't see, carrying a gravity that pulled at her thoughts even when she resisted it. And for 3 days she heard nothing from him, no messages, no calls, no accidental run-ins, which should have brought relief but instead made the absence feel deliberate, like a test she hadn't realized she was taking. And by the fourth night, when she finally sat down on her couch and admitted to herself that she missed the clarity of his presence, her phone buzzed with a single message asking if she was free to talk. No pressure, no assumption, just an opening, and she surprised herself by answering immediately. They met again, this time not in public but not private either, a quiet rooftop above one of his buildings where the city lights spread out below them like a living map. And the moment she arrived she understood the choice, because up there the noise softened, the distance gave perspective, and Victor stood near the edge with his hands resting lightly on the railing, watching the city the way a general might study a battlefield, calm and calculating. And when he turned to her there was no smile, only honesty, and he told her that the past few days had been complicated, that a negotiation had gone wrong, that someone had tested boundaries they shouldn't have. And while he spoke she felt the weight behind his words, the kind that came from consequences rather than drama, and she realized this was the other side of him, not the controlled charm or quiet intensity but the burden of decisions that rippled outward, affecting people who would never know his name. He didn't glorify it, didn't soften it either, just laid it out plainly and told her he wouldn't blame her if she walked away now, because the closer someone stood to him, the more clearly they became a target. And as the wind moved around them and the city pulsed below, Maya understood that this was the moment where curiosity ended and choice began, because Victor wasn't asking her to be impressed or seduced but informed, and that mattered more than she could explain. So instead of giving him an answer she asked him what protection really meant in his world, and he said it meant loyalty, vigilance, and responsibility, not ownership, not control, and certainly not cages disguised as comfort. And something in the way he said it eased a fear she hadn't known she was carrying, the fear of being consumed rather than chosen. They talked for hours that night, about boundaries, about independence, about how two lives could intersect without erasing each other. And when she admitted that part of her was afraid of losing herself in his shadow, he told her that he had no interest in shadows, only in standing beside someone who knew who they were. And the sincerity of that statement settled deep, because it wasn't a promise of safety or forever but of respect. And as the night stretched on, Maya began to notice small things again, how Victor never stood with his back fully turned to an entrance, how his phone buzzed with updates he skimmed quickly before silencing, how his attention always returned fully to her when she spoke. And she realized that despite the danger attached to his name, he was more present than most men she'd known who lived far safer lives. When it was time to leave, he walked her to the elevator, another elevator, functional this time, and for a brief second the memory of their first meeting pressed in on her, the broken lights, the forced closeness, the unexpected calm, and she wondered if fate had a sense of humor or if this was simply what happened when two paths crossed at exactly the wrong and right moment. And as the doors closed, Victor stopped them with a hand and asked her one last question, not about dinner or time or feelings but about agency, asking if she wanted to keep seeing him, knowing everything she now knew, knowing it wouldn't be simple or quiet or easily explained to friends. And the weight of that question settled heavily because it asked her to choose not comfort but clarity. And after a long pause she nodded and said yes, not because she was fearless but because she was tired of living half engaged with her own life. And Victor accepted that answer with a nod rather than a smile, as if he understood that yes carried responsibility as much as desire. and over the next weeks their connection deepened in careful increments, meetings spaced but intentional, conversations layered with trust, and Maya found herself learning the rhythms of his world without being swallowed by it, understanding when to ask questions and when silence was safer, and yet just as she began to believe balance was possible, a crack appeared in the surface when a woman she'd never seen before approached her outside her office one afternoon, well-dressed, composed, and smiling without warmth, introducing herself as someone who worked with Victor, and suggesting, in a voice too polite to be accidental, that proximity to powerful men came with consequences not everyone survived, and as the woman walked away leaving fear hanging in the air like a warning flare, Maya understood that the real test hadn't been the elevator or the dinner or even the truth, it was whether she would stand her ground now that the risks had found her too.
Maya stood frozen on the sidewalk long after the woman disappeared into the crowd. Her heartbeat loud in her ears as the city kept moving around her, indifferent to the quiet threat that had just been delivered with a smile, and for the first time since meeting Victor she felt the sharp edge of fear cut through curiosity, because this wasn't abstract danger or implied risk anymore, it was personal, deliberate, and close enough to touch, and she wrestled with the instinct to run. To block Victor's number, to change her routine, to retreat back into the safety of anonymity. But another part of her, the part that had learned to speak up in that elevator, refused to be handled by intimidation, so instead of going home she called Victor and asked to see him, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, and within minutes a car was on its way, not black and imposing this time but deliberately ordinary, because Victor understood the language of visibility as well as power. They met in a secure penthouse she hadn't been to before, high above the city but sealed and quiet, and the moment the door closed behind her Victor's composure shifted just enough to reveal concern, not panic or anger but focus sharpened by responsibility, and when she told him exactly what the woman had said, every word, every tone, his jaw tightened, not in surprise but in recognition, as if he'd been waiting for this shoe to drop, and he didn't interrupt or reassure her prematurely. He listened until she finished, then apologized, not vaguely but directly, for underestimating how quickly others would involve her, and that apology mattered more than any promise of protection because it acknowledged her agency rather than denying the threat. He explained then that the woman was connected to a rival faction, one that preferred psychological pressure over open conflict, that intimidation was a test designed to see whether Maya would retreat on her own, and hearing that ignited something in her that felt like anger braided with clarity, because she hadn't chosen Victor's world but she had chosen Victor, and she resented being reduced to leverage in someone else's calculation. They argued then, not explosively but honestly, Maya insisting she wouldn't be hidden away like a liability, Victor countering that safety sometimes required distance, both of them circling the same truth from different angles, until finally he said the one thing she hadn't expected, that if she chose to step back, he would respect it fully, no persuasion, no resentment, because consent in his life wasn't negotiable, and that statement cut through the tension, because it made the choice hers again rather than a reaction to fear, and after a long silence she told him she wasn't leaving but she needed transparency, real transparency, not just fragments, and Victor agreed, not with words but by opening doors, introducing her to the reality behind the rumors, explaining alliances, rivalries, and the delicate balance that kept violence from spilling into chaos, and over the following days Maya saw pieces of his world up close, not crimes dramatized or glorified but systems managed, risks assessed, people protected as often as they were controlled, and while none of it was clean or simple, it was more structured and intentional than she'd imagined, which didn't excuse it but contextualized it, and that understanding didn't erase fear so much as refine it into awareness. Still, pressure mounted from the outside, subtle changes in her routine that made her hyper-aware, a car that followed too long, a stranger who lingered near her building, and each time Victor responded swiftly but quietly, reinforcing that this wasn't about dominance but deterrence, and through it all their relationship deepened in unexpected ways, built less on romance than on trust forged under stress, late-night conversations where vulnerability replaced flirtation, where Maya admitted she was scared but unwilling to surrender her autonomy, and Victor admitted that caring for someone outside his world was both a weakness and a reminder of what he was protecting, and it was during one of those nights, sitting across from him in the soft glow of the penthouse lights, that Maya realized the most dangerous thing about Victor wasn't his power but his restraint, the fact that he chose limits when he could choose force, and that choice made him more human than legend. The tension finally broke when the rival faction pushed too far. escalating from suggestion to action, and Victor made a decision that reverberated through his network, not violent but definitive, drawing a boundary so clear it couldn't be mistaken. And when it was over, the threat receded as quickly as it had appeared, leaving behind a fragile calm and the understanding that this wouldn't be the last test, only the first. And in the aftermath, Victor asked Maya again, quietly, without ceremony, if she still wanted this life adjacent to his, knowing the cost and the scrutiny and the resilience it would demand. And Maya answered without hesitation, not because she believed love conquered all, but because she had learned that fear didn't disappear when you ran from it. It just waited, and she would rather face it with open eyes and a partner who respected her strength than retreat into a smaller version of herself. And as she said yes again, this time without doubt, she understood that the elevator hadn't just trapped her with a mafia boss, it had set her on a path where choosing dinner had turned into choosing courage. The calm that followed the confrontation felt unnatural at first, like the quiet after a storm when the air is too still and every sound seems louder than it should be, and Maya found herself waiting for the next disruption even as days passed without incident, because once you learn how fragile safety can be, peace stops feeling permanent and starts feeling earned moment by moment. And Victor understood that instinctively, adjusting routines, shifting meetings, reducing exposure, not in a way that confined her but in a way that respected her boundaries while quietly reinforcing them. And through it all, Maya noticed something unexpected. She wasn't shrinking under the pressure, she was adapting, learning the rhythm of caution without letting it harden her. And that realization gave her a sense of competence she'd never felt before, a confidence born not from ignorance but from informed choice. Their relationship evolved in that space, less dramatic but deeper, marked by shared mornings rather than stolen nights, conversations over coffee instead of adrenaline. And it was in those ordinary moments that Maya saw the man behind the myth most clearly, the one who read reports before dawn, who remembered names and details others dismissed, who carried the weight of his decisions quietly rather than theatrically. And she began to understand that leadership in Victor's world wasn't about intimidation but continuity, about making sure tomorrow existed in a form people could rely on, even if they never thanked him for it. Yet the outside world never fully receded, and one evening Victor returned later than expected, his expression unreadable in a way Maya had learned to recognize as warning rather than fatigue. And when she asked what was wrong, he didn't deflect, telling her that a federal investigation had begun circling his operations, not close enough yet to strike but close enough to demand strategic restraint. And that revelation shifted the stakes again, because legal scrutiny didn't come with the clarity of rival threats, it came with uncertainty, with long timelines and invisible lines that could be crossed without knowing it. And for the first time, Maya considered the possibility that loving Victor might mean enduring not just danger but loss in quieter forms. Distance, secrecy, waiting. They talked late into the night about contingency, about what would happen if his world narrowed, about the reality that some fights couldn't be negotiated away. And Victor admitted something he rarely voiced, that control was an illusion he managed daily, not a guarantee he possessed. And hearing that stripped away any lingering fantasy Maya might have held, replacing it with a sober understanding of what partnership meant in his life, not rescue or escape but resilience. The investigation forced changes, meetings moved overseas, communication tightened, time together became precious rather than assumed, and Maya felt the strain of it in the small things, missed dinners, unanswered texts that eventually came with explanations she trusted but didn't love. And still she stayed, not out of stubbornness but because she recognized that stability wasn't the absence of stress but the ability to endure it together without losing respect. And Victor never once asked her to wait without context, never used mystery as leverage, and that transparency became their anchor. The pressure reached a peak when Victor suggested, gently but firmly, that Maya consider relocating temporarily, not as an order but as an option, a way to step out of the spotlight while things recalibrated. And the suggestion hit harder than any threat because it implied separation, not permanent but indefinite, and Maya wrestled with it honestly, torn between independence and connection, safety and solidarity, until she realized the question wasn't where she should be but who she wanted to be in this story. And she told Victor she would go, but on her terms, with a timeline, with continued communication, with the understanding that this was a strategic pause rather than an emotional retreat. And Victor accepted that compromise with visible relief, because it meant she wasn't disappearing, she was choosing survival without surrender. The farewell wasn't dramatic, no declarations shouted into the night, just a quiet morning, packed bags, a shared understanding that distance didn't equal abandonment. And as Maya boarded the plane, she felt the weight of uncertainty settle alongside a surprising sense of trust. Not blind faith but earned confidence in the man they had become together. And from afar she watched his world continue to turn through messages and updates. through silences that spoke of caution rather than absence, and she used the time to ground herself, to build a life that wasn't defined solely by proximity to power but strengthened by the courage she discovered within it. Months passed, the investigation cooled without igniting, alliances shifted, and when Victor finally asked her to come back, not because danger had vanished but because balance had returned, Maya knew the answer before he finished the sentence, because she understood now that love in their world wasn't about promises of safety but about choosing each other with full awareness of the risks, and as she prepared to return, she realized that the elevator 40 minutes had never been the most important part of their story. It was the choices made afterward, again and again, in quieter rooms and harder moments, that had transformed a chance encounter into a partnership defined not by fear but by deliberate, resilient trust. Maya returned to Chicago on a clear autumn morning, the city unfolding beneath the plane like a familiar map she now understood differently, because distance hadn't erased fear or love but refined both into something steadier, and when Victor met her at the private terminal there was no dramatic reunion, no rush, just a quiet embrace that carried months of restraint and trust, and in that moment she knew they had crossed an invisible threshold together, from uncertainty into intention, because what survived distance and pressure wasn't infatuation but choice. Life didn't suddenly become easy when she came back, but it became honest, structured around clarity rather than reaction, and Victor's world, while still complex and demanding, felt less opaque now that she understood its rules, its limits, and its costs, and she stepped into it not as an accessory or secret but as a partner who knew when to stand close and when to step aside, and that balance reshaped everything, from the way they shared space to the way decisions were discussed rather than declared. The city tested them again, quietly this time, through rumors, through watchful eyes, through moments where patience mattered more than power, and Maya discovered she had changed in ways she couldn't undo, carrying herself with a confidence that came from surviving proximity to fear without letting it define her. And Victor noticed too, trusting her instincts, inviting her perspective, recognizing that strength didn't threaten his authority but complemented it, and together they built a rhythm that outsiders couldn't quite read, because it wasn't dramatic or chaotic but deliberate. The memory of the elevator surfaced often, not as trauma but as origin, a reminder that 40 minutes of forced stillness had stripped away distraction and revealed character, and Maya sometimes laughed at how small the moment had seemed compared to everything that followed, how a broken machine had created space for truth to enter, and Victor admitted once, late at night, that he had known within those first minutes that she was different, not because she was fearless but because she listened, because she asked questions that mattered, because she didn't shrink when the lights flickered, and hearing that reframed her own memory of the fear she'd felt, transforming it into evidence of courage rather than weakness. Time moved forward, not in leaps but in layers, and they faced choices together, some public, some private, some that required sacrifice, and when the question of the future finally demanded an answer, it came not as a proposal wrapped in spectacle but as a conversation held over dinner, the same simple ritual that had begun it all. Victor asking her if she wanted a life built on shared responsibility rather than fantasy, on realism rather than illusion, and Maya answering yes without hesitation because she understood now that love wasn't the absence of danger but the presence of trust strong enough to face it. The city never stopped being dangerous, power never stopped attracting attention, but their bond became an anchor rather than a liability, and people noticed, not because they flaunted it but because stability is rare where volatility is expected, and Maya learned that influence could be quiet, that presence could be protective, and that saying yes once didn't define her nearly as much as continuing to say yes every day with open eyes. On the anniversary of the elevator incident, they returned to the building not out of nostalgia but curiosity, standing briefly in the lobby where it had all begun, the elevator doors opening smoothly this time, lights bright and reliable, and as they stepped inside Maya smiled at the symmetry, because nothing about her life was stuck anymore, not her fear, not her ambition, not her heart, and when the doors closed and the car descended, she realized that the most powerful thing she had gained from those 40 minutes wasn't romance or danger or status. It was the courage to choose, again and again, and when Victor reached for her hand, steady and certain, she knew that dinner hadn't been the end of the story at all, it had been the beginning of a life defined not by chance but by intention, and that was the kind of ending worth every risk it took to get there.